Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to our housing session. My name is Bradley LaFortune. I work at Public Interest Alberta, and I'm very excited to be with you all today to talk about housing. You know, when we're looking at housing as a right, which we're going to hear from Carolyn Whitzman today to talk about, we are in the midst of a housing crisis in Alberta and across the country. I've had the very special honor of being in a room with Carolyn Whitzman about 6 months ago at the Broadbent Summit in Ontario. And I can honestly say, even though we don't know each other very well yet, that you are one of my teachers. And one of the reasons that we have become so committed here in Public Interest Alberta and Parkland to address the housing crisis from a human rights perspective, and not being afraid to think about very bold and sort of, interventionist policy tools that we can use to really, turn the corner on the crisis that we're facing. Carolyn Whitzman is an expert advisor with the HEART project, which is the Housing Assessment Resource Tools project. And you've written 7 books, I believe, is at the University of Ottawa and has worked with the City of Ottawa and a whole bunch of other governments to really think seriously about addressing housing from a human rights perspective and looking at all the tools that we need to address it. We're going to hear from her, and then we'll open it up to discussion. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Carolyn.
I'm delighted to be here. I'm very grateful to the Parkland Institute for inviting me. I hope to build on what Avi's been talking about in terms of the Green New Deal, what Angela's been talking about in terms of the productive economy, including what I call the caring economy. I guess I'll start off with a little quiz. How many of you know about the National Housing Strategy Act? Not the National Housing Strategy, several billion, well, a lot of $1 billion. The national, okay, there's one semi-hesitant. How many people know about the National Housing Strategy Act? Okay, a few people, but not enough. Okay, in 2019, the Government of Canada passed the Housing Strategy Act. It builds on Canada's being a signatory of a whole bunch of international human rights covenants. And it says that Canada is going to work towards a progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And there's certain aspects of it that I want to draw out to you before I go any further. The first is the notion of adequate housing. So we measure some things, and I'm going to be talking a lot about affordability today because affordability is really important. But when we're talking about housing need in Canada, we don't yet include accessibility for people who need it, although that's in the UN definition of the right to housing. We don't talk about security of tenure, and yet we know that nationally 6% of tenants were evicted between 2016 and 2021. There are ways to measure it, but it's not currently in the measurement of Canada's measurement of housing need. We don't talk about location, even though we know that people are being increasingly forced to drive until they qualify for an affordable place, and it could be an hour commute in either direction. Again, we have the mechanisms to count that in the census, but it isn't included in housing need. We don't talk about cultural adequacy in relation to, for instance, for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing. We're not quite there yet at even being able to measure a baseline of where we're at in Canada in terms of adequate housing. The second thing I'm going to talk about today, or at least going to be underlying what I talk about today, is the notion of progressive realization. Governments love quick fixes. And the fact is that Canada hasn't been investing in affordable housing for well over 3 decades. It may take another 30 years, if we live that long, to redress the neoliberal austerity mistakes that were made in the 1990s, and even some mistakes that I might touch upon that were made in fact, I will be touching upon, that were made in the 1970s, about the time that you saw that huge whoop off the cliff of public spending. There were some terrible mistakes made by the Trudeau senior government in 1972. So 30 to 50 years of disinvestment, it ain't gonna change overnight. The third thing I want to emphasize is an emphasis on the rights and voices of those who are most marginalized, which is there in the legislation. including Indigenous people, much more likely to be homeless. The single group that's most likely to be in housing need, single mothers. Racialized households, households with different abilities who've been systemically excluded over the years in Canadian housing. And the last thing I want to talk about is something that the CMHC used to do, it hasn't been doing recently, which is to talk about income and income categories. I'm going to be talking about that a lot. The Housing Assessment Resource Tools talks about that a lot. I'm not suggesting that you do this during my presentation, but maybe during the next break, if you go heart.ubc.ca, you put in the city that you live in, let's say it's Edmonton, you will immediately see not only housing need as it's measured in the census, but broken down by income category, broken down by size of household, broken down by priority populations. Canada used to do it. It's not doing it. It paid us to do it, thank you, but it should be doing it. And the fifth aspect that underlies what I'm going to say, and I'm not going to have enough time to talk about it adequately, frankly, is for Indigenous by Indigenous housing. And again, that's not only the National Housing Strategy Act, that's the fact that we have signed on to the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. And because of the unique status of Indigenous people whose land was stolen and whose rights have been ignored and who are at much higher risk of homelessness, it's vital for them, I'm not Indigenous, to define, develop and manage culturally adequate housing on Indigenous land and land back. The HEART project, the Housing Assessment Resource Tools project, has only been around for a couple of years. We're funded by the CMHC through the Housing Supply Challenge, and we work with governments across Canada, housing providers, and advocates to improve how we measure and respond to housing need towards that rights-based goal. Projects based at UBC. I personally telecommute from Ottawa. Canada has a housing crisis. My friend, colleague, Ricardo Tranjan says housing crisis is the wrong word to use because it's just capitalism functioning as usual. But I'm going to argue that it's a housing crisis. That crisis has a number of aspects. One of them is, as I've already mentioned, that the current measures of housing need are flawed, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. A second aspect is that affordable housing is being lost a lot more quickly than it's being created. And again, my friend and colleague Steve Pomeroy has measured 15 homes available at less than $750 a month were lost for every new home created between 2011 and 2016. The rate went slightly down 2016 to 21, only because there were very few places available at $750 a month. But $750 a month is what you can afford if you're earning minimum wage across Canada, and a third of Canadian workers earn within $3 of minimum wage. So $750 is a number that's affordable for a lot of people, but it currently doesn't really exist anymore. And despite the National Housing Strategy, there are no coordinated efforts to use government and nonprofit land for non-market housing. And I'll get into that in a minute, but that is the single most important thing that the federal government has done before and could do again to help alleviate the housing crisis. I'm going to be talking a bit about three potential game changers. One of them is that we need targets, but not 5.8 million aggregate new homes by 2030. They need to be targets that are based on a basic rights-based notion of who can afford or who needs what, at what cost, where. And aggregate supply approaches don't really get at that. And as a basic start, we need to double the stock of non-market housing. We need to scale up well-located affordable housing, both market housing and non-market housing, and that involves a whole suite of mechanisms that have worked in other places, worked in Canada in the past, and can work again. And the third thing we need is looking at finance in terms of deep affordability. So I talk about $750 a month. If you're on welfare across Canada, and you're an individual, what you can afford is between $375 and maybe $450 a month. That's the kind of affordability we need to look at. And it's scary numbers. I just published a report 2 weeks ago now with the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, and I said, just call it the Scary Number Report. You don't need to give it another title. So HART has 3 tools. The first is a housing need assessment tool, and we use census data. And as you'll see, there's big problems with census data, but at least it's standardized, it's evidence-based, it's replicable across time, it's comparable between different jurisdictions and municipalities and provinces and territories in Canada as a whole. So we use that to break down housing need. And I should say that the housing need assessment tool, it's one of those frustrating cases where the federal government, who have paid for this tool and who used to use a similar tool, have said, this is awesome, we're going to completely ignore it now. Our second tool is a land assessment tool. So we worked with 13 municipalities across Canada, and we mapped government land, municipal, provincial. Actually, Alberta said, we're not going to tell you what provincial land we have. And we said, well, FOI you. And they said, you can't FOI us. And I'm like, anyhow, culture of secrecy in Canada, don't get me started. But we did what we could with the information that was available, and we mapped all well-located we mapped all government land. We looked at what was off limits in terms of it's a park, it's a floodplain, it's got a big building on it already. And we were left with a shed load of government land. To use the technical term, well-located government land that could be used for nonprofit housing. We worked with both Edmonton and Calgary, and they've incorporated it into their policies, which is great. And our third tool was acquisitions tool, because one of the key ways to stop the hemorrhage, to stop the plug out of the bathtub of housing, is to have nonprofits acquire affordable housing that's at risk of being lost. There is an acquisition fund that's just getting started in BC. There's an acquisition fund in Nova Scotia. There's an acquisition fund quite new in Toronto. There's one in Montreal. A few places in Canada have an acquisition fund. I can't say this enough. Canada used to fund acquisitions as part of its non-market affordable housing strategy. That tool is still waiting for the federal government to do what many people have suggested, which is an acquisition strategy. But it does look at best practices, and it does provide tips for governments, including municipal and provincial governments that are doing acquisition strategies. We've been very busy over the last 2 years, and very effective, I think, in getting the message out. Let's talk income categories. Traditionally, the CMHC has used income quintiles. So you take all of the household incomes in Canada, and you say the lowest 20% we're going to call low income, and the next 20% we're going to call moderate income, and then the next 20% we're going to call median income, and then the next 2 percentiles we're not going to worry, they're sorted, they're higher income. Unfortunately, we had to add another category, very low income, because since the 1990s, welfare rates have just not risen at all with inflation or what any kind of affordable housing conceivable, including a rooming house room, could be purchased on a monthly basis for. So we have the very low income category, which we break down in each metropolitan or regional area. We take area median household income. 20% of that is very low income. There should be nobody in Canada living on, barely surviving on 20% of median income, but that's about 3% of the population, 2-3%. Then low income, that equates with minimum wage, as I've mentioned. Then moderate income, and traditionally the CMHC looked at low and moderate income, so 50 to 80% of area median household income, and then median income, and unfortunately affordability issues have crept up into median income, where it's getting increasingly difficult to rent if you're an average income professional in some cities. Almost impossible across Canada to be a first-time home buyer if you're a middle income person, and then higher income. So if you look at core housing need in 2021, the number is a little less than 1.5 million households. That's about 10%. So 1 in 10 households are in core housing need using census definition. As I say, very low income households are a small proportion of the private household population. The people who are housed are actually a huge proportion of the unhoused, and I'll get to that in a moment. Well over 2/3 of them are in housing need. Low income, about 18% of all households, well over a third are in core housing need, etc. One of the things I should say is that 2021 had a much lower number of households, and proportion of households in core housing need. It was about 1.7 million in 2016. What happened? Was it an extraordinarily successful national housing strategy? No. Does anyone want to guess what happened? Why it went down? Why core housing need went down by 250,000 households? The biggest decline in core housing needs since it started getting measured in 1991. If you look at temporary relief measures, the census measures where people are and what they're paying in May of 2020, 95% of the benefit of CERB went to the lowest income, not quintile, but 10th. The vast majority of people who benefited the most, incomes going up 500%. On average, were very, very low income people. That's what influenced core housing need being as low as 1.45 million households. It'll change in 2026. It'll change a lot. Now, I've been talking about core housing need as it's measured in the census. The census leaves out as many people, perhaps more, in housing need than it counts. Homeless people aren't included for census purposes in core housing need because they don't pay anything. They don't live in a home. The estimates vary widely because Canada isn't very good at counting homeless people, and if you don't count people, they generally don't count. There are 2.3 million tertiary students in Canada, that is in colleges and universities. They aren't counted in core housing need. It was a political decision to exclude them. I know why it happened. It happened for technical reasons that, again, in May, sometimes students aren't still in residence and sometimes they go back to the parental home, et cetera, et cetera. But what Statistics Canada or the federal government said, in a particularly brutal way, you can look it up, is that being a student is a temporary and voluntary position of poverty, so we're not going to count students. And that means that there has been virtually zero policy that deals with student housing need since the 1990s. People in congregate housing who don't have a private entrance or don't have their own kitchen or don't have their own bathroom, they aren't counted in core housing need because it isn't a private home. So that's people in long-term care homes. It's people in group homes. It's people in institutions. It's people in rooming houses. 700,000. Mostly individuals, sometimes couples. In congregate housing, they don't count. Farm workers, most of whom are in temporary farm workers in very horrific conditions, they aren't included because farms don't count in core housing need. So if you took the 1.45 million households and you added 1.9 million households, which is a very conservative estimate that I just did for the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, you'd end up with 3 million households who can afford no more nationally than $1,050 a month, many of whom can't afford more than $420 a month. And that's the deficit that we're dealing with right now in Canada. As I said, this is a scary numbers presentation. I'm going to get to the more cheerful stuff in a minute, I promise. So how do we meet these needs? How do we meet the needs of at least 300,000 very low-income individuals and households, many of whom have high support needs because the correlation between indigeneity and multi-generational trauma and disability is really, really strong. So they're either homeless or at imminent risk of homelessness. How do we meet the needs of at least the same number of single moms who are quite often a paycheck or a welfare payment away from homelessness? How do we deal with the 1.4 million students, some of whom are international, some of whom are local? Doesn't really matter. One of the nice things about the National Housing Strategy Act is it governs everyone in Canada, not just citizens. They need affordable accommodation, and it hasn't even been in the policy realm since the 1990s. How do we deal with the needs of 700,000 people in congregate housing, not all of whom are in inadequate housing, but enough are, very high proportion are? How do we deal with about 2 million households who may not be ultra low income, may not be threatened imminently with homelessness, but are, for instance, adults living with their parents simply for affordability reasons? Or they are people who have roommates who they may or may not like, but they're living with the roommates not because they want a roommate, but because they need affordability issues. Those are two of the fastest growing types of households in Canada. And none of those groups are in the conceivable future going to be part of the home ownership community. So we've had a national housing strategy since 2018, and I'm actually not going to spend my time slam dunking the national housing strategy, as easy as it is. The Parliamentary Budget Office, hardly a hotbed of radicals, said that the national housing strategy will be spending $89 billion by 2028. It was originally costed at $40 billion. But in all of that, there will be, and there has been, decreased spending on low-income needs. There are two big programs in the National Housing Strategy. One's called the Rental Construction Finance Initiative. The other is called the National Co-Investment Fund. The Rental Construction Finance Initiative, 3% of the dwellings created out of the biggest cost NHS program have been suitable and available to people in core housing need. And people who are homeless don't even ask. In terms of the co-investment fund, it's slightly better. It's a little bit less than a third, but with a critical lack of family-sized housing. So it's mostly smaller units that have been made available through the majority, like 26 billion, 13 billion of the two biggest strategies. The only strategy that's worked has been something that was worked out on the back of an envelope. I know where it happened and who it happened to, the Rapid Housing Initiative. That's not a continuing strategy. It was announced in the 2020 budget as part of COVID-related measures. It has been two other bits of $1 billion, $1.5 billion each. And I'm sorry, it's like $1.5 billion, that's not much, but you know, the Rental Construction Fund is 26 billion, so just to put it in context. And that's the only program that's been directly about meeting the needs of people who are homeless or in core housing need, despite the fact that the targets were around homelessness and core housing need. So there's been a plethora of reports saying Canada doesn't even know how many people are homeless, let alone whether any of its programs, which are run into the multiple billions of dollars, help people who are homeless. Canada doesn't know whether the National Housing Strategy is coming anything close to meeting its targets. I'm going to talk about supply. Everybody's talking about supply. And there is no doubt Canada has an aggregate supply problem. Canada has fewer home completions than it did in the early 1970s. 50 years ago, when Canada had half the population it does now, and it had bigger households. But let's unpack aggregate supply for a moment. Most of the current stock of purpose-built rental was built in the 1960s and the 1970s, which means two things. One is it fell through a hole in the 1970s, which it did, and even more so in the 1980s and the subsequent decades, only showing a slight increase recently. A lot of what was being built in the 1970s was purpose-built rental, not just studio and one bedrooms, but two bedrooms and 3 bedrooms. A lot of that stock is aging, and particularly the affordable housing stock is at imminent risk, over 500,000 homes, of being lost. But if we're looking at falling off a cliff, the real place where we fell off a cliff was non-market housing. So if you look at the early 1970s, there was a point where non-market housing was 25% of all of those home completions. If you look again in the early 1980s, there was a point where non-market housing was 20% of all home completions. And then you look at the federal government gradually de-investing in the late 1980s and just completely de-investing, giving it to provinces. Provinces said, no way. They gave it to municipalities. Municipalities said, no way. About either 655 or nearly 900,000 non-market homes, about 50,000 were built after 2000. So they're aging. And their affordability is threatened by the need for necessary repairs, energy efficiency, etc. We're in bad shape. Now I'm going to get more cheerful. 5.8 million homes by 2030. Surely that's ridiculously unattainable. But I'm here to tell you that the equivalent of 6 million homes was built over a little more than a decade in Canada after World War II, after there was a tremendous home shortage. A combination of government land acquisition, favorable finance, and modular development created over 1 million homes for heroes, which if you take it in terms of current Canadian population, that's pretty close to 6 million homes. Unfortunately, the guidance from nice housing folks like us in 1944 is that that should be public housing. It wasn't, it was sold off. So a home that was sold for $3,000 in Toronto in 1946 sold to its third owner in 2021 for $2.1 million. The same house, substantially unrenovated. That's called land value, right? So we could have still had it as public housing if we kept it as public housing, but the goal of home ownership, finance said, that the Department of Finance said was far more important. Sweden built 1 million homes between 65 and 74 through government land, through modular construction. Wonder where IKEA comes from? It came from the Million Home Program, and that's the equivalent of 6 million today. Singapore became independent from the UK in 1966, and it was poor, and it had a lot of issues, and still somehow it built 147,000 homes, that city-state. It was pretty small, about 1 million people, and that's equivalent to 6 million homes today. An interesting model that combines home ownership with owning the land, which means that home ownership is still very attainable and even affordable in Singapore. All of those countries had less money, less industrial capacity than Canada does today. So there might be something to learn from that, something to learn from our history, something to learn from other countries' history. And some European countries, and I apologize, there are actually some Asian countries, South American countries, and African countries that are doing great. It's just that the Europeans are best at the statistics. And I love me some good statistics. Canada has been building about 1,000 non-market homes a year. Austria has been building 72,000 non-market homes a year, equivalizes the population to Canadian population, the equivalent of 72,000 homes. Denmark's been building 17,000 homes, but it's also been doing 40,000 deep energy retrofits, because that's what Denmark does. And Angela was talking in the last session, I just wish that Canada would look over the pole like we did in participation ads when I was a kid in the 1970s and go, why can't we be like those Scandinavian countries? Finland's been building 62,000 non-market homes. Well, the population equivalent of. I could go on. Although I'm not saying that any of these European countries have austerity beat. They don't. They are capitalist. They are doing so much more than Canada. France in 2000 had 20% targets of non-market homes. That's of total stock. So it's at acquisitions, new build. Then it raised it in 2016 to 25%. In Paris, it's now a 30% target. And the national government sets that on municipalities, checks every year, finds the municipalities that don't. And it's had a remarkable effect, particularly in some rich, stubborn municipalities. And again, I could go into a whole, because I'm a historian, a whole story about Germany and how Germany divested itself of a lot of public housing when it unified and then went, oh damn. And Germany is in a oh damn moment right now where their targets across the country are 20% of all new construction being non-market home. But Hamburg, for a number of years now, has had a goal of a third nonprofit, a third regulated rental, and a third market ownership. And I saw this rule of thirds and I went, whoa. Canada in 1944 said that what we needed to combat the housing shortage was a third public housing, a third regulated rental, and it suggested co-ops in 1944, and a third market ownership. Maybe the Hamburg was stealing from that 1944 report. Unfortunately, Canada didn't steal from that 1944 Canadian report. So how do you scale up? I can't overemphasize the land question. Again, this is a report from McKinsey, not a hotbed of radicalism, and they say that the biggest intervention is free leased government land, and this is an international report on housing affordability. Closer to home, this is a report from 2019 from Vancouver, found that free leased government land plus non-market development in 2019 could create rental homes that were affordable to moderate income people, and then you'd need to have further grants or financing or housing subsidy to make it affordable for low-income people, but that's a good bit of the way in Vancouver. So again, we've been hearing a lot about zoning and building enablers. Zoning was, in its very nature, exclusionary. It excluded people who weren't nuclear families. It excluded people who didn't have a lot of generational wealth, quite often people of color. It's exclusionary. It needs to end. And it is ending really, really rapidly, which makes me very, very happy, I have to say. In places like Portland, exclusionary zoning has been turned on its head. In a lot of zones, it's very hard to knock down a house and build a new McMansion or a new monster home. Minimum parking regulations, cars seemed like a really good idea at the time. Now, not so much. They need to be eliminated because parking is one of those things that actually I think the market should be setting the price for it. It's not a necessity. We don't exist to house cars. We exist to house people as a society. Minimum as of right building heights. That means that approvals can be delegated instead of being bargained one development at a time. Density bonuses are being used in a lot of places to make it more competitive for non-market development. The current government is picking up on a simplified set of zones, and that's exciting to me. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. I want to talk very briefly again about some countries that are doing better. And we have some folks from Finland who are coming to Ottawa to speak to some federal people in January, because Finland has managed to virtually eradicate chronic homelessness and street homelessness. And it's done it, as they say, you can't have housing first without housing, first, through radically growing its non-market housing stock. So this is a development in Helsinki, 650,000 people, 10,000 homes in a former Portland, and a third non-market, a third regulated rental, and a third ownership. Back to the rule of thirds. And also 8,000 workplaces, and also supportive housing in there, and student housing in there, and congregate group homes in there. It's possible, it's happening. Aspern Seastraat, Vienna. Well, Vienna is a world unto its own for 100 years. Former airport like Downsview in Toronto, developed by the Municipal Housing Company, which has been going strong for 100 years with the brief interruption for fascism. 10,000 homes, 12,000 workplaces, 2/3 nonprofit. I've been there last year. It was still under construction. There's already a train station, there's already buses, there's already a walkable downtown. Munich, 1.5 million, similar to Calgary, a little bit more than Edmonton. It is a greenfield development, but it's a smallish greenfield development with 8,000 homes, 12,000 workplaces, 50% non-market. Already has the train stations. La Caserne de Rilly in Paris. I mentioned Paris has 30% goals. This is a former barracks. It's 100% non-market housing. It's got this amazing park in the middle of it with cafes and filled with kids, even though it's a quite new development, right downtown. It's a place of beauty. It's a gathering place. It's a place that adds to the city. And it's 100% non-market housing. But let's come a little closer. St. Lawrence in Toronto, developed in the 1970s and the 1980s, federally owned real lands, leased to the city, developed by the city, 4,000 homes. with 3 schools downstairs, a community center, a supermarket, a bar, a church, etc., held together by a beautiful linear park, a third public housing, a third co-op, a third condos. I'm old enough to remember when people used to come from around the world to Toronto and go, Canada, tell us how you do your cool non-market housing. And more recently, Fraserview in Vancouver, relatively small development by international standards, 1,000 homes, broke ground in 2018, built in 2022. Or Beaver Barracks in Ottawa, where I live. It's a city block, 250 affordable homes, including one built over an ambulance station. It is public land, and it has district heating, and it was nominated for the World Habitat Awards because of its distributed heating and energy efficient beauty. It's a beautiful development. So I've mentioned the loss of affordable housing, so 550,000 homes, but below $750 lost between 2011 and 2021. Absolutely, there needs to be an acquisition strategy. There's a deficit of 3 million affordable homes. Not all of that needs to be new build. Some of it can be acquired, but keep in mind that those acquired buildings have people living there right now. Even the universe of short-term rental is nowhere near 3 million. There's also subdivision that's possible. Some of it needs to be new builds. Some of it can be acquisitions. Acquisitions can be faster. It can be cheaper, not necessarily. Let's look at how much we're spending on housing. Absolutely, 89 billion is a scary number. The majority of it, as I think I've mentioned, is corporate welfare. It's 0.6 of total GDP. As I mentioned, France, which has these very healthy targets and a federal finance bank that both directly loans and guarantees loans, 1% of GDP, which is what we in Canada have been calling for a long time. Finland, which has nearly eradicated homelessness, 1% of GDP. Germany, which had that oh dang moment, 1.45% of GDP right now on non-market housing. Austria, less than Canada, because they have the systems in place that has allowed the creation of non-market in a consistent way. And both Austria and Denmark have this amazing sort of churning community bank, which you only get if you get a certain amount of policy stability, where you loan money, the money comes back, you reloan it for a number of years. So I've already dumped on federal financing. The 1980s were fueled by 35-year low-interest loans at 2% when the market rate was 6%, which is what it is now. You can do that, but the finance department says, oh, no, we don't want to run a deficit. Or you can do like the Rapid Housing Initiative and have upfront grants. But the federal government now is saying, oh my God, debt. I do want to stress, as Angela did, that this is all artificial thinking, artificial austerity thinking. We could have a purpose-built grant and finance program to scale up non-market. We don't have it now. We've had it in the past. We can have it again. In terms of provincial financing, I really hate the provincial level of government. I mean, it's not Alberta. It's not personal. I just hate provinces. The Rapid Housing Initiative, it really did come out of the back of an envelope. And the problem is that when you're building supportive housing, it needs supports. It needs ongoing operating funding. It needs adequate health and social services. And the federal government kind of forgot, to be fair, to ask provinces about that. But Alberta, Ontario, Quebec have all been slashing their supportive housing budgets while running surpluses. So it is possible, as is threatened in long-term care, to link federal health and social transfers to supportive housing. That would be great. It is possible. Canada has done this twice before, just like it did with unemployment insurance or employment insurance, to say, dang it, I know it's not our direct responsibility, neither is zoning, but we want rent control now. It did it in 43 when the Canadian government had the guts to say landlords are profiting over a housing shortage, and that lasted until 49. There was national rent control between 42 and 49. In 75, the federal government strongly suggested that provinces enact rent control, and every single province and territory got the hint, even Alberta, and put in rent control, then they started clawing it back. And of course, in places like Alberta and Ontario, not to some extent in BC, but it's better in BC, it's just aggregate supply. It's aggregate supply. It's trickle down. There are no sub-targets for supportive housing or for long-term care or for low-income housing. The federal government's responsibility is infrastructure funding, and housing is infrastructure. But the provincial government's responsible for landlord-tenant relations, including horrible rent control issues, eviction issues. It's responsible for health and social services, and it's doing a really bad job of it. It's responsible for welfare and minimum wage, and it's doing a terrible job at it. And at some point, we are a country. The federal government needs to take leadership on these issues, at least in terms of, as I say, conditional payments. As for municipalities, well, I worked for a municipality for 10 years. I kind of like municipalities. Vancouver and Toronto are places where property tax rates are really low, and they're higher for rental properties. That actually dings renters. I could do a whole analysis of the tax system in Canada and show how from capital gains tax exemptions on down, it's all in favor of homeowners and nothing in favor of renters. When I'm talking about places like Denmark and Austria and Germany and Switzerland, those are places that are majority renters. They're wealthier than Canada. People are able to save up for a retirement. Why can we not have the kinds of rules that allow people to have secure long-term rental housing and invest in other things? Again, I don't really have time. I could get into land value tax. I could get into progressive property taxation. There's a world of things that municipalities can and should be doing rather than development contributions. So in summary, the federal government needs to have leadership. It needs to have good data. It needs to have consistent definitions of affordable housing, which it hasn't had in its programs. It needs to have conditional infrastructure funding. The provincial government needs to have tenant protection, including eviction protection and rent regulation. It needs to have adequate welfare to allow people to live, to reduce and alleviate poverty, and it needs to have co-funding in the case of deep affordability, as well as health and social supports. And municipalities need to approve things a lot quicker and a lot more as of right. It needs to be able to develop, as Edmonton and Calgary do to some extent, government land for non-market housing, and it needs to overcome some of the barriers to well-located housing. So what does it look like when it's fixed? I have a friend in South Africa who always starts out with that question. What does it look like when it's fixed, no matter how nightmarish it is now? What it looks like when it's fixed is Canada is a wealthy country. It should have functional zero homelessness, which Finland has now. What functional zero means is not that no one will be homeless ever. It means that homelessness is rare, it's dealt with quickly, and it doesn't recur again and again. That's what functional zero homelessness means. Steady decreases in core housing need, which we haven't, other than the CERB bump, seen since the 1990s. Doubling nonprofit housing for a start, and then the kind of 20% target that France had 23 years ago. Also, sufficient 3+ bedroom rental homes, well located so that half of journeys can be by active transport. Urban land banks sufficient to meet Indigenous housing needs. Also, what we had in the 70s and 1980s, where median house prices were 3 times median household income. Now, across Canada, its median house prices are 9 times median household income. House prices in Toronto are 11 times median household income. In Vancouver, 13 times median household income. I'd love to say, here's the magic way to get house prices down across Canada by a third, down to a third of what they are, down in Toronto to a quarter of what they are, down in Vancouver to a fifth of what they are. I don't think you want that to happen too rapidly. I think that would be very bad for the majority of Canadian households, frankly. But it is the dilemma that we find ourselves in. So that's it. That's how to stay in touch with me, and I hope you have enjoyed this whirlwind ride through Canadian housing policy.
Our next presenter is someone who also has been a teacher of mine. Laura Murphy is the research coordinator, outgoing research coordinator for the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab, which is a lab here at the University of Alberta. Also past chair of the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness, and an all-around awesome advocate for housing, adequate housing, and housing as a human right here in Edmonton and Alberta. So.
So I guess we're all here to talk about housing, and Carolyn has done such a great job of explaining such a complicated, nuanced challenge into more manageable pieces. You've given such a great overview of all orders of government having a role and some of the moving pieces. My presentation is going to focus a little more on the local context and what this kind of means in Edmonton. I do include a little bit of information about Alberta and Calgary, but Edmonton is the primary focus. So just a really brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about the current state of housing, where we're kind of at in Edmonton, what a rights-based approach to housing means. That's a phrase we hear a lot. What the financialization of multifamily housing also means, and how we can address in access to good housing choices, adequate housing choices. So just to give a brief rundown of where we're kind of at, this is using 2021 census data. Basically, in the city of Edmonton and surrounding area, roughly half of tenants live in primary rental housing, which means purpose-built housing that was intended for renters. I think around 49%, and then a little over half, about 51% of tenants in Edmonton live in secondary housing. So housing that was not purposely built for rental, which can include single-family homes, condos, things of that nature. Calgary's quite different. The vast majority of tenants live in secondary housing, which is a little over 70%, which is similar across Alberta. About a third of tenants in Alberta live in primary rental, and the remainder live in secondary rental housing. What's important to note with primary purpose-built rental housing are the gaps between tenant incomes and the current costs, which is something we're all pretty familiar with, either experiencing that personally or kind of witnessing and maybe being caught up in some of the secondary spillover effects of our housing crisis. So in Edmonton and surrounding area, a one-bedroom apartment, I think, was around a little over $41,000, just to give you a reference point in 2021. And the income of households who couldn't afford housing, which was around a little over 50,000 households, the average income was around $35,000. And that's for a one-bedroom apartment, so it only gets worse from there. So that's kind of where we start to see where some of this picture starts to crystallize. And I'll share my slides, and I'll update them with the numbers so you can have those at hand. Carolyn's already talked about where we are losing a lot of our quote-unquote more affordable market rental housing. Between 1997 and 2008, around the time of our housing boom, rental costs essentially doubled in Edmonton, while incomes have largely remained flat. In 2006, 82% of tenant households paid rents less than $999 a month. And to be clear, that was still unaffordable for a lot of households, but that's just a general benchmark. In 2016, 29% of tenant households paid rents less than $999 a month. So we're starting to get a picture here of what's kind of happening. So when we look at market wages and we compare those with rental wage, so rental wage is really just what's the average cost of a primary rental apartment or rental suite over time, and what the minimum income would be needed to afford their average rental, which would be less than 30% of income. So we can see, looking at men disaggregated by age, over time, incomes have somewhat kept pace, but that's starting to decline. We also see that the average rental wages for a one-bedroom, two-bedroom, and three-bedroom apartment are also widening. So in the early 90s, the costs between one-bedroom to three-bedroom were a little tighter, and this is widening in recent years. This is very much a gendered issue. Alberta has some of the worst wage disparities, actually the worst wage disparities across Canada, 40 years strong. So when we look at women compared to men, We see that incomes were always much lower, but up until the 2000s, many women were able to still afford housing choices. So whether that be a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, or a 3-bedroom, depending on family formation. And that really starts to be eroded in and around our housing boom in the early 2000s. To get a closer look at this, I just wanted to show these two graphs to compare the gender differences. But if we zoom in, we can kind of see that housing choices are becoming much more limited for women, which has real implications for housing choices. There were recent articles in CBC about delays of divorce and family formation because of housing costs, and it's a really significant problem. And Edmonton, Alberta is kind of lauded and held up at this standard of affordability, right? We hear that a lot, and it's often used as an excuse to maybe combat some policies or some changes that would be of use for renters. Realities are even more dismal for social assistance. Social assistance rates have never kept pace with market rents, and if we're not going to be regulating market rents, we need to make sure that social assistance rates at the very least keep pace. So what's interesting is, I know we're in a housing crisis. We're in a lot of crises right now. We're in a living crisis. There's a lot of crises going on in the world. But back in the 1970s, there were also a lot of marches in Edmonton. There were a lot of calls for housing as a human right. There's moments where affordability is, phrased as the inability to be able to buy a house, which is something that's even hard to comprehend these days. There's always been movements, and there's always been people pushing for change in Edmonton. And I think we lose a lot of historical context and a lot of where we came from, which can make it really difficult to understand where we're going. So I just wanted to include that. And I'm going to be moving into talking a little bit about financialization. And I want to be clear, this is not about vilifying a business practice or vilifying any group of people. And in fact, Manulife Insurance Company owned apartment buildings back in the day. That formation and what that looks like means different things in today's world, but there are some practices that have always been in place, but there are significant policy changes that have kind of created the crisis that we know it today that we're in. So what does a rights-based approach mean? We hear this a lot. We have federal legislation talking about a rights-based approach to housing. To me, it really just means accountability, transparency, monitoring. Where are we at? Where do we need to go? Really kind of starting from the place of rights holders, people who are unable to access good housing choices, and really kind of staying there and engaging in meaningful participation, meaning those that are really experts on our housing crisis, those that are living in it, are resilient and are finding ways to navigate, should really be at the center of all that we discuss in terms of policy and the work that we do. It's really all about scratching beneath the surface to understand major trends and emerging challenges that negatively impact the realities of households unable to access housing choices. And I know Carolyn's already highlighted the 7 criteria of adequate housing. We hear a lot about affordability. That's just one of 7. I like the definition that the UN uses of adequate housing, which is kind of a catch-all term to describe the 7 pieces at minimum that need to be in place to ensure that people have access to good housing. So security of tenure is one, availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure, affordability, which is the one that's kind of front of people's minds, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. When we talk about some of the underlying trends and emerging challenges, specifically how they relate to security of tenure and affordability, financialization is one of those major trends. What is the financialization of housing? It's not a punchy term. It's a term we hear a lot. It's kind of hard to, have some sort of a catchy shortening of, but for me, it's really just the change from housing as a basic need to an item investment. The primary purpose of housing isn't really for people to live in it. I mean, that's what does happen most of the time, but the focus is really on housing as a way to park wealth and generate more wealth. We really saw this take off with the most recent economic crisis, although I think we're in one right now as well, not quite the same as the mid-2000s. But investors were looking at places to park money outside of, the market and outside of the stock market, and housing. People need it. It's an essential need. So that's really where a lot of this stuff started to take off. So as a result, housing really becomes detached from local housing needs, local incomes, and local economies. And we can see on the graph really the average cost of a single absorbed house. So meaning a house that was built and then sold in Edmonton between 1990 and 2020. We really see in the mid-2000s that the cost of single family homes doubled in 3 years, which is wild and unprecedented. We also see that incomes have largely remained flat and haven't kept pace. Housing also becomes really separated from its social function of providing a place for people to live in security and in dignity. And I have to credit Lynn Hanley. This is Lynn Hanley's hot take on what financialization of housing is. Local housing is just not owned by local people in a local community. It's owned by investors, which can take a number of different forms, many of which may not even know that they're investors. Some could be living locally, but it's largely likely that the money exists across Canada or even globally. And this is a totally different relationship to housing. We hear a lot about housing supply, and it's typically in relation to developer and homeowner, builder and homeowner, tenant and landlord. But the elephant in the room and the third party are really investors. So what does housing supply mean when we're building for investors and we're not building for local people to meet local needs? Again, this is another kind of characterization of a previous chart, but around 51% of tenants in Edmonton and during the last census lived in secondary rental, and the remaining 49% lived in primary. I did some work with the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab where I put together a database of primary rental that's owned by financialized landlords, and estimated in 2021, roughly half of primary rental is owned by financialized landlords. That increased slightly to 48% in 2022. The project kind of ended at the end of 2022, just for reference. So what's interesting is we've also had record numbers of housing being built in the last few years that's rental. A lot of this were condo projects that converted into rentals towards the end. But we really see that primary financialized housing is really increasing, and that's something to be concerned about. And we also see how this plays over time, just with costs of housing. And really, investors started to heavily get into the market between 1996 and 2000. There was one owner that really bought up a lot of property. But we also see some peaks in the mid to late 2000s. And also around COVID, that was kind of an unprecedented time for investors to get into buying up more housing. So what does this all mean? Why does this matter? If we look at the average rental wage, minimum rental wage over time, for a one-bedroom apartment, a two-bedroom apartment, and a three-bedroom row house, and we also graph this against the percentage of financialized primary rental suites, it does seem that the costs of housing seem to be quite aligned with the purchase of financialized owners. Another way of looking at this is what are the average rental increases? We really do see bumps in the average rental increases going up with the increase of the percentage of primary rental that's owned by financialized owners. Financialized owners, they have systemic practices to really extract wealth, to extract the most wealth as possible. One is to really kind of stop, investing into repair, to maybe divest from services available on site, and to kind of, continue to raise rents. And the other is this kind of renoviction that's become quite a hot topic where it's kind of investing in luxury renovations. And then, in Alberta, because we don't have rent control, tenants can live in an apartment and kind of sit through all of the stresses involved with renovations, and then the 13th month of the year, get hit with high rental increases, and we've seen that happen, which results in a lot of displacement, right? So we've seen that in neighborhoods across Canada, even in our own, where some are being hollowed out. What's really interesting when we talk about supply is when I went in and looked at how much housing is actually being built by financialized owners, very small, less than 5%. So that's also something to keep in mind. With a lot of housing policy, things get conflated, things get kind of mixed in together, and the Federal Housing Advocate is doing a panel on financialized housing right now, and financialized owners are all about talking about supply, but they're not actually adding any new supply by and large. When we talk about an acquisition strategy, it's interesting to see where some of the trends are with what kind of homes and what kind of suites are being purchased over time. There's kind of a split between older housing that was built between the 60s and the 80s, as well as housing that was built in the 2000s and later, which is becoming more of a trend now, buying up some of these really fancy looking apartment buildings that are, kind of tailored for a luxurious experience, which, everyone would like to have, but that's also having a real impact and is quite appealing to financialized owners, many of which share that in their annual reports. I think it's important to remember that much of our housing has already been bought up by financialized owners, but some of it still remains. And I think to go back to the 7 criteria of adequate housing with an acquisition fund, do these homes that still exist, are they in a good state of repair? Do they meet standards of accessibility? We really need to be thoughtful about how we move forward and always keep people that need access to housing choices at the center of these decisions. It's interesting to look at the different forms of financialization. In the late 90s to the mid 2000s, not to call anyone out specifically, but Boardwalk was a real estate operating company, publicly traded, and then they converted to a real estate investment trust in the 2000s and are the largest financialized landlord of about 1/3 of all financialized suites are owned by Boardwalk in Edmonton. Asset management is quite a catch-all category. That can mean pension funds, that can mean sovereign wealth funds. It's quite vague and quite open, but that's also come catching fire in recent years. And pension funds have also become under a lot of scrutiny, especially public pension funds. Who are like the biggest owners? We all kind of see the ads, so it's by no surprise. Boardwalk is the biggest, followed by Main Street, which is a real estate operating company, Avenue Living, Hazelview, Timber Creek, depending on, they had some bad press, so they rebranded themselves as Timber Creek from what they've been doing in Ottawa. And then Centurion, which is also a REIT. And then the remaining asset management companies own about 22%, 23%, and the remaining REITs own about 13%. More needs to be done, certainly with understanding the geographical implications and where things are kind of focused, but this isn't done randomly. There are areas in the city that are definitely more financialized than others. This is just a quick synopsis of number of suites where they're located and are owned by financialized owners as of 2022. So what needs to be done? Carolyn's done a great job of really setting us up well and really being quite specific about different orders of government. We really need to track beneficial ownership of housing. Much of this exists in the shadows. It's very difficult to track. It's very difficult to know who owns our housing, and there's real implications for that. Every province has been tasked with creating a beneficial ownership strategy. Guess which province hasn't taken it seriously, despite estimations that Alberta actually has the highest amount of money laundering of any region across Canada, which is also not been taken seriously. But other provinces have done this work. BC already has an beneficial ownership registry that's publicly searchable and available. Quebec and others have begun work. Alberta is really the only one, I believe, that has yet to do any work, unless anyone else knows otherwise, but last I checked. We also need to measure the impacts of financialization, when we really need to monitor the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. What that means is measuring those 7 criteria and really coming to this from the standpoint and the perspective and the expertise of those living it. And that's how we really get a good benchmark of where are we at? How were things in the past? Where do we need to go? We often hear all the time from different politicians that, well, we just don't even know what to do. We don't even really know what's happening. But there's ways that we can do that. We also need policies that prevent displacement. So any sort of public funds need to be tied to policies that prevent that. We also need to expand support for non-market housing. Not surprising, I'm sure, to the crowd, is Alberta and Edmonton has some of the worst outcomes and some of the worst statistics for social housing and subsidized housing across Canada. By population, less than 3% of households live in subsidized housing, and of that 3%, around 58% are living in housing that's still unacceptable. So meaning households are either paying more than 30% of rent, living crowded, and are living in a home that's in a state of major repair. Those are numbers that are unprecedented across Canada. We also need to regulate public pension funds. So I know that's a hot topic with what's happening provincially and what implications could be, but I think it's also important to keep in mind financialization of housing. Our federal pension fund is heavily invested primarily in the States, but also in REITs that are involved in healthcare and clinics and things like that as well. We also need to strengthen tenant protections. I know the Alberta Law Review that's a project that they're working on right now, and this really lives provincially, but there are also ways that we could strengthen tenant protections federally. We did have a rental cap for, I think, 16 months many, many decades ago, but it is possible. So I'm just going to wrap up with just where you can learn a little bit more about some of the things I've talked about and some opportunities to engage in action. The Federal Housing Advocate commissioned research on the financialization of housing. Martine August did a really wonderful outlay of all of the different ways that we can address financialization, whether it be for rental or other forms. So I direct you to check them out. The National Housing Council, as mentioned, there's a review panel examining the financialization of purpose-built rental. We'll see what comes of that, but at the very least, this is a topic that's gaining traction and visibility. Mark your calendars, because on November 21st, there's a coalition across Canada that's calling for social housing. It's a campaign of 50,000 suites per year for 10 years. And this is a cross Canada campaign, so take a picture or we'll share this online. That's something you can sign on for and share amongst your circles. So they're doing like a kickoff to this campaign on November 21st. And on National Housing Day, November 22nd, if you live in Edmonton, the Edmonton Coalition on Housing and Homelessness is screening the documentary Push, which features Leilani Farha, who will be opening the movie with some statements. So check it out. I think tickets are $15, and there's also other ways to get tickets too. And then last but not least, if you want to really learn more about the financialization of housing, the context in Edmonton, Alberta, and Canada, and you really want to dig into other forums and learn a bit more about the project, check out the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
These signs are all over the city. I don't know if it's a criminal syndicate that's putting them up. They're illegal. I've called the city saying, who are these people? And they say they can do nothing about it. I don't know who these people are who can buy houses. I've heard between a quarter and a third of new home purchases don't require mortgages because they're moneyed up people or corporations investing. It's not private owners, families. Is that true?
I don't know about the percentage because most of this lives in the shadows, and if we had good information on who owns what, that would make it a lot more clearer. But there does seem to be a lot of infill projects in Edmonton and homes that are priced at very high rents that seem to be kind of unbothered if they're vacant or not, which is interesting. The buy homes for cash is really interesting. I think that lies with provincial and real estate regulation, but basically what happens is someone comes into your home, typically a real estate agent or some sort of agent, you sign a contract. There's not a lot of clarity on what that means, but this person basically is offering to list your house for you, and then there's so many conditions baked in. Typically, the money, if it comes through, that the homeowner receives is much less than the commission that the person can get, and they're usually lowballed, and it's usually preying on people that are quite desperate, that maybe can't afford their mortgage or trying to move. But that's really all I can speak to, unless Carolyn can add any more.
For about 80 years, the social contract in Canada has been that everybody can and should be a homeowner, that homeownership was the risk-free solution towards a happy, healthy, economically secure retirement. I think we're seeing the wheels fall off that. We had a loss of home value pretty major in the 1980s, also associated with mortgage rates. And there are plenty of people who are underwater right now. The home that they own is worth less than the mortgage payments that they're paying. And absolutely, this will be an opportunity for disaster capitalism, as it's called. But more importantly, or at least more long-term, people are living longer, and without adequate places for older people to downsize in secure rental or assisted living or long-term care that will allow people to live in dignity at the end of their lives as they eminently deserve. Homeownership, that social contract that homeownership is something that all Canadians can and should aspire to, it's falling apart, and we need to deal with the consequences of that. So it's a very high-level answer to a very specific sign, but I think it's something that we need to reckon with.
I wanted to touch on the concept of the rights-based approach. In 2014, the Women's Legal Education Fund launched sought an application in Tanud Yaya v. Canada in the Supreme Court. In their application, the plaintiffs sought a declaration by the governments of Canada and Ontario to be obligated in implementing an effective national and provincial strategies to reduce and eventually eliminate homelessness and inadequate housing. The majority decision of the Supreme Court struck down that appeal. In the Justice Later's opinion, the court ruled that it is not the responsibility of the court, that it is non-justiciable to grant rights under Section 7 of the Charter, that the right of liberty and security is a positive right. The Legal Aids Ontario said that essentially the courts have stated that the legal front is not an approach, as of for now, in addressing this issue, and that we have to focus on the political realm. What strategies on the political realm do you think are effective, and do you think, in my opinion, is tenants unions, and how would tenants unions be worked out, and where does the labor movement, how can it get involved in working with tenants unions in addressing the issue? Thank you.
That case, which is a pretty well-known case, comes from before the National Housing Strategy Act, and part of what the Supreme Court said was, yeah, absolutely, Canada's signed on to international covenants, but it's not domestic law yet. It is domestic law now, so I wouldn't give up on a legal perspective. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say, and this is my realpolitik focus, is absolutely we need ACORN, we need tenants unions, we need rent strikes. We also need to think about what are the big tents that are going to be working for more non-market housing. And tenants are still the minority in Canada. They're a little over 30%, definitely growing. There's a huge, of course, generational difference. So it is old boomers like me versus young folks like you. But that's going to take, a bunch of us dying off to actually get the conditions that would allow a majority perspective. But one of the things that I always say to people my age, I'm 60, is do your kids have the same opportunities as you did? And are you worried about what happened to my mom, which is, despite all her best attempts as a homeowner to save, ending up in grossly inadequate long-term care? If those two things concern you, and they sure as heck concern me, then maybe you want to be paying more attention to tenants' rights and to the need for greatly expanded non-market housing. So I'm a coalition builder kind of gal. I'm not a mass movement kind of gal. Well, I have a different definition of mass movement, or a different placement in mass movement. So that's what I'd say.
I think what's interesting is there's a critical mass of people that are being affected by our housing crisis, which we kind of saw in the 60s and 70s. And that group of people rose up and said, we need something different. And a lot of social housing was built. We need mechanisms for tenants, certainly. And we're seeing that tenants are forging that themselves. We're seeing tenant unions being successful in negotiating with landlords, or at least bringing truth to light and bringing out of the darkness some of the practices that are happening and providing evidence in the public forum. We're also seeing, the law is a colonial construct, right? So is our legal system, so are our orders of government and our legislation at all orders. But we're seeing really interesting things with encampments, where there are rights that are being championed in courts and are really kind of directed at municipal governments, but we're also seeing some legal challenges happening provincially with access to the adequate amount of social supports as well. So those are some of the things that are happening. I think labor unions can really take leadership with really getting an understanding of if you're paying into a pension fund, what is that pension fund? what are mutual funds? What are the companies at the center of that? Are there derivatives? Is it like a piece of a company, or a piece of a company's debt? Or is the pension fund actually lending money to financialized donors? So I think by really mobilizing within unions and kind of demanding for clarity and transparency, that's also a way forward. And I think we just really need evidence-based decision-making that's actually based on evidence. And we've tried this, we have a lot of information, but we're really kind of never really coming to this from the perspective of the person who's living it. So I think those are all things that we can push for ourselves and collectively.
I feel like we're seeing more Airbnbs popping up in the city every day. I mean, I've gone canvassing in neighborhoods where whole blocks have been bought up and they're Airbnbs, and are we looking into how much effect that is having?
No, we're not. But if you check out the Affordable Housing Solutions website and different types of financialized housing, I do have a lot there on short-term rentals. They tend to be geographically located in our most walkable areas, which in Edmonton has also been kind of commodified because we're not a walkable city. And this has also had really damaging impacts for displacement. And we've seen this happen in other cities where there's been a ban and really tight regulation on number of days. But yeah, if you're interested, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but check it out and contact me if you have any other questions. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. These are two of the most brilliant housing advocates in the country, so we're really lucky to have them. One more round of applause for Carolyn and Laura.